The sound of Charles Whitaker's black limousine screeching to a halt echoed through the driveway, breaking the eerie silence of the mansion. He hadn't meant to come home early, but an unsettling feeling clawed at him, urging him to return sooner than expected. As he stepped out, the cold emptiness of his home hit him like a wall. The sight of his son's wheelchair by the door seemed to send a chill down his spine. Little did he know, the discovery that awaited him inside would change everything. Before the story continues, like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more videos. Charles paused at the door, his gaze lingering on the wheelchair. In the 2 years since the tragic accident that left Ethan paralyzed and claimed his wife Olivia's life, Charles had meticulously controlled every aspect of his son's world. He believed that if he could isolate Ethan from everything that had caused him pain, his son would eventually heal. But what Charles had failed to see was that this overbearing protection had suffocated Ethan's spirit. The mansion, though lavish and immaculately kept, had become a hollow shell, an environment designed for safety, but devoid of life. As Charles moved through the halls, the quiet felt unsettling. Nothing was as it should be. Ethan had withdrawn, retreating into himself, and Charles had never truly noticed. The silence of the house felt oppressive, and Charles's unease grew with each step. Little did he know, he was about to discover something that would shatter the very world he'd spent 2 years trying to preserve. The silence of the house felt oppressive, and Charles's unease grew with each step. Little did he know, he was about to discover something that would shatter the very world he'd spent 2 years trying to preserve. His footsteps echoed down the long hallway, each click of his shoes bouncing off the polished marble floors like a countdown to the unknown. He could feel his chest tightening, a heaviness weighing him down. There had always been a quiet emptiness in the house ever since Olivia's death, but today it felt different. Something was off. Something in the air, something that tugged at his gut, whispering to him that there was more happening here than he could see. When Charles reached the living room door, he paused for a moment, hand resting on the polished brass doorknob. His breath hitched in his chest, the sudden weight of anticipation hanging in the air. He didn't know what he expected to find, but whatever it was, he wasn't prepared for this. He pushed the door open. The sight that greeted him froze him in his tracks. There in the middle of the room, Ethan was laughing, truly laughing, in a way Charles hadn't heard in years. His son, once a shadow of his former self, was now alive with joy. He wasn't sitting quietly in his wheelchair, staring at the world from behind a veil of sorrow. Instead, Ethan was sprawled across the floor, his eyes sparkling with a brightness Charles had thought lost forever. And there was Maya, kneeling on all fours, her yellow dress swishing back and forth as Ethan clung to her shoulders. He was bouncing up and down, his legs wrapped around her waist, giggling as she crawled like a child playing. The wheelchair sat abandoned in the corner of the room, forgotten, as if it no longer mattered. For a fleeting moment, Charles forgot everything. Forgot the wheelchair, the accident, the years of grief. In that brief instant, he saw his son as he used to be. Carefree, joyful, the young boy who had once raced around the garden, chasing butterflies and laughing with his mother. A rush of relief and warmth surged through him, but just as quickly, his pride snapped him back into reality. What is this? The joy that had lit up Ethan's face was now tainted by Charles's growing anger. His son, his precious Ethan, was playing with a servant's child, crawling around on the floor like an animal, in a way that Charles could never have imagined for his son. The scene was wrong. It was beneath them. Charles's mind raced, his thoughts tangled in a web of confusion and fury. How dare she? His eyes flickered to Maya, who had stopped crawling as soon as she noticed him standing in the doorway. She froze, her wide eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and confusion. Ethan's laughter faltered, and the light in his eyes dimmed slightly as he looked up at his father. The tension in the room shifted, turning thick and suffocating. "Maya, get off him!" Charles's voice was low, but it carried the full weight of authority. Maya hesitated, her body trembling slightly. I'm sorry, sir. We were just playing." No, Charles interrupted, his voice rising, more forceful now. You have no business doing this. He's not some toy for you to entertain. Get off him, now! Maya's face went pale and she scrambled to stand, her yellow dress wrinkling as she awkwardly pulled away from Ethan. Her hands shook as she straightened up, glancing nervously at Charles. Ethan's eyes, wide with confusion, darted between the two of them. Dad, stop! No, Charles snapped, his fury reaching its boiling point. He stepped forward, ignoring Ethan's protest. This is wrong, Ethan. I don't care how much you've been playing. This isn't how things are supposed to be. You shouldn't be doing this with someone like her. Maya flinched at the harshness in his words, but it was Ethan who spoke next, his voice breaking through the growing tension like a crack of thunder. Stop it, Dad! Ethan's words were sharp, a flash of defiance in his usually quiet eyes. For a moment, Charles faltered, taken aback by the force of his son's tone. Ethan pushed himself up on his arms, his body trembling as he slowly lifted himself from the floor, using his weakened legs for balance. He stood, albeit shakily, but his determination was evident. Why are you being so mean to Maya? She's my friend. Charles's anger flared even brighter, but something in his son's voice made him pause. His gaze shifted back to Maya, who stood awkwardly, her eyes lowered, face pale. Ethan, now standing as best he could, faced his father, his small hands balled into fists. This is not how we behave, Charles snapped, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and confusion. You, Ethan, you should not be engaging with her this way. You're better than this. Maya's voice trembled as she spoke up again, her eyes meeting Charles's. It was my idea, sir, she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. I wanted Ethan to smile again. He was so sad before, and now he's happy. Charles's chest tightened at the sound of her words, but it didn't quell his anger. In fact, it made his rage burn even more. How dare this girl think she knows what's best for Ethan? She was just the servant's daughter. What did she know of his son's needs? No, Charles hissed. You don't understand what's best for him. He needs discipline, structure, not this. He waved his hand toward the floor as if dismissing the whole scene. You're not his friend, Maya. You're just someone from the lower class who has no business getting this close to him. Maya stepped back, her face falling. Ethan's gaze flickered between his father and Maya, his confusion growing. Dad, he began, his voice cracking with emotion. Why can't you see that she makes me feel normal again? Why do you always think I'm broken? Charles felt a pang of guilt in his chest, but he quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't about his guilt. This was about doing what was right, what was best for Ethan. You're not broken, son, Charles said through gritted teeth, his voice tight with emotion. But you are fragile. You can't go around doing this, acting like everything is fine. You need to be protected from people like her. Ethan's face went pale as he took a step away from Charles, his small hands clenched tighter into fists. I don't need protection, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with determination. I need to feel normal. I need to laugh, and I need a friend who doesn't look at me like I'm some sick person to be fixed. Maya stood frozen, her heart racing as she watched the exchange. Her mind raced. What was happening here? Why was Charles treating Ethan this way? She had only ever wanted to help, to make Ethan feel like the child he once was. Charles didn't know what to say. His words caught in his throat, his mind spinning. He had always believed that his control over Ethan's life was what kept him safe. But now, seeing his son stand up for himself, seeing him demand respect and happiness, Charles realized something he hadn't wanted to admit. He had been holding Ethan back. He had been suffocating him in his need to protect him from the world. The tension in the room was unbearable. Both Maya and Ethan were silent, waiting for Charles to speak. Finally, he opened his mouth, but the words that came out were nothing like he'd intended. I'm sorry, Ethan, he muttered, his voice shaking with the realization of his own failings. I just wanted to protect you. But Ethan shook his head, his eyes filled with both hurt and defiance. You don't protect me by keeping me locked in a cage. The silence between them was thick. Maya stood quietly, her heart pounding. She couldn't bear to watch anymore, but she knew this moment was critical. For Ethan, for Charles, for them all. Charles's chest felt tight. His world, the one he'd spent so long trying to protect, was crumbling. But this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Ethan and the son he had failed to see for so long. Maybe I've been wrong, Charles whispered, barely audible. Maybe I've been protecting you from the wrong things. Ethan's eyes softened, a glimmer of hope returning to them. Maybe you have, Dad. Maybe you have. The tension began to ebb, but the distance between father and son, built over years of control and misunderstanding, was still there. And as Charles looked at Ethan, he knew they had only just begun to confront what had been broken between them. Charles's breath was heavy, each inhale sharp, each exhale slow and calculated. His hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white with the strain. He stood there in the middle of the living room, staring at Ethan, who was still standing with the support of his hands, though his legs shook beneath him. The sight of his son, usually bound to a wheelchair, standing tall before him with defiance written on his face, was too much for Charles to bear. The reality of it all, his son, his precious son, trying to assert his independence, was breaking him. Charles's eyes flickered to Maya. She stood nervously by the door, her eyes darting between him and Ethan, her body language tense but resolute. Her yellow dress was wrinkled from the play, a far cry from the immaculate image of the well-behaved servant's daughter Charles had always imagined. His chest tightened as he realized what had happened here. She had corrupted him. She had somehow managed to chip away at the fortress he'd built around Ethan, his protection, his control. How dare she? Ethan, look at yourself. Charles's voice trembled with anger, but he tried to mask it with authority. This is beneath us. He gestured toward the floor where they had just been playing, his gaze flicking between Maya and his son. You, of all people, shouldn't be engaging with someone like her. She's from the lower class, Ethan. She has no place in this house. His voice turned cold as he looked at Maya with a sense of disgust. And you, Maya, he spat, should know better. You've crossed a line. You've ruined everything. Maya flinched under the weight of his words, her face paling. Ethan's face, however, was flush with anger. His eyes, once filled with sorrow and quiet defeat, now burned with emotion. He wasn't the broken, fragile child Charles had come to know. He was someone else, a boy who had found strength in the most unlikely of places. I don't care about your status, Dad. Ethan's voice cut through the air like a sharp blade, raw and filled with emotion. He took a trembling step forward, no longer relying on his wheelchair, standing on his own 2 feet with a shaky determination. Maya is my friend. She makes me feel normal again. She makes me laugh in a way I haven't in years. And you don't get to tell me who I can or can't be friends with. Charles's chest tightened even more, his anger escalating as his son's words rang through him. The audacity, the disrespect. Ethan had never spoken to him this way before. He had never challenged his authority, never stood up to him like this. And it made Charles feel small. You don't get it, Ethan, Charles thundered, taking a step toward him, his voice rising. You can't just go around treating everyone the same. There's a difference between people, Ethan. People like us, he gestured to himself, don't associate with people like her. He turned to Maya, his eyes cold and accusing. "You're nothing but a distraction. You're a servant's daughter, and you have no place in my son's life. You shouldn't even be here." The words stung, and Maya felt her heart drop into her stomach. But she stood her ground, meeting Charles's icy stare with a bravery she didn't know she had. "I don't care about your money or your house," she said quietly but with undeniable firmness. "I only care about Ethan's happiness. That's all I've ever cared about. You can yell at me all you want, but I'm not going to apologize for making him smile again. I'm not going to apologize for making him feel normal when you've been treating him like he's broken." Charles was taken aback. The boldness of her words shocked him, and for a brief moment, he wondered how a girl like Maya could have the courage to speak to him this way. He, a man of wealth, status, and power. He, the father who had always protected his son from the world. But before he could process his thoughts, Ethan spoke again, his voice a mixture of anger and hurt. "You think I'm broken, don't you?" Ethan's words were soft but packed with a quiet power. He looked up at Charles, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You think that because I can't walk, that means I'm not worthy of real friends, of real joy. You've kept me locked away in this house, protected from everything. You've tried to make me perfect, but you've forgotten one thing. Being perfect doesn't make me happy, Dad. It just makes me alone." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and full of unspoken pain. Charles stood frozen, his chest tight, as his son's words pierced through him like a dagger. He wanted to shout, to refute what Ethan was saying, but something inside him twisted, something he didn't want to acknowledge. Was Ethan right? "I'm not going to apologize for being his friend, Mr. Whitaker," Maya continued, her voice now shaking with emotion but still resolute. "I'm not going to apologize for making him feel alive again. You can't protect him forever. One day he'll have to live in the world, not in this house. And if you keep pushing him away from the only person who truly sees him for who he is—" Her voice faltered, but she caught herself, taking a deep breath. "Then I'll just have to be the one who shows him that there's more to life than what you're giving him." Charles stared at her, his mouth opening and closing as if he were struggling to find the words to defend himself. He wanted to say something, anything, but the truth weighed heavily on his tongue. Could he really say she was wrong? Could he honestly believe that Ethan needed protection from everything? From her? Ethan took a step forward, his legs trembling under his weight. He was barely standing, but the strength in his words was unshakable. "I need a friend, Dad. Not someone who's constantly telling me what I can't do, what I can't have, what I can't feel. I need someone who makes me feel normal again. I need someone who makes me forget the chair." The silence in the room was deafening. Charles's anger was still bubbling inside him, but it was mixed now with something else, something he didn't want to admit. Guilt. Regret. The realization that he had been so focused on protecting Ethan, so obsessed with sheltering him from the world, that he had robbed his son of something crucial. Freedom. He took a shaky breath, trying to regain control of his emotions. Charles's voice broke. He cleared his throat and tried again, the words coming out more quietly this time. "I just don't want you to get hurt, Ethan. I only wanted to keep you safe." Ethan shook his head, tears slipping down his face as he looked at his father. "You've been keeping me safe from life, Dad, and I'm tired of it. I just want to live." Maya, who had been standing still in the background, now stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "If you really want to keep him safe, you'll stop keeping him locked in here. You'll stop pushing people away. You'll let him have a life, Charles. Let him have a friend." Charles stood there in stunned silence, his eyes flicking between Ethan and Maya. He didn't know what to say, how to fix this. The world he had so carefully constructed around his son was beginning to crumble, and he didn't know how to stop it. He had spent 2 years trying to protect Ethan, trying to shield him from the pain of the world. But now, standing here, he was realizing the terrible cost of that protection. Ethan wasn't living. He was merely existing. "I'm sorry, son," Charles said softly, his voice barely audible. The words felt foreign to him, but he forced them out, despite the sting of vulnerability they brought. I'm sorry for not seeing you." Ethan's eyes softened, the anger and hurt fading into something more profound, something that resembled understanding. He didn't speak right away, but his small nod spoke volumes. Charles turned to Maya, who was still standing in the corner, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "You've given him something I couldn't," he said quietly, the words taking him by surprise. "You've given him joy." Maya's breath caught in her throat as she realized the gravity of Charles's words. She nodded slowly, her heart swelling. "All I wanted was for him to smile again, that's all." Charles's gaze shifted to Ethan, who was watching him with an intensity that Charles had never seen before. And for the first time in a long while, Charles realized something that made his chest ache. He had been the one holding Ethan back. The silence between them was still thick, but something had shifted. Something had broken open. And for the first time in 2 years, Charles felt a small crack in the walls he had built around himself and his son. Charles stood there, feeling the weight of the words he had just spoken. The silence that followed was deafening, a silence that seemed to press in on him from every angle. His chest was tight, his heart racing, but his mind refused to settle. The last few minutes felt like a blur, too much, too fast. His entire world, the world he had worked so hard to build around his son, was unraveling before his eyes. Ethan and Maya stood across from him, locked in a quiet but intense exchange of glances. Ethan's face was flushed with frustration, his eyes no longer the broken, distant gaze of the boy he had been only a few months ago. Now, Ethan stood tall, his fists clenched, his shoulders squared. There was a strength in his stance, a strength Charles had never seen before. "You still don't understand, do you, Dad?" Ethan's voice was low but firm, the hurt evident in every word. "I'm not fragile. I'm not some glass doll you have to protect. I need to live my life. I need to feel normal again." Charles's jaw tightened at his son's defiance. The words felt like a slap to the face. He couldn't reconcile the boy in front of him with the child he had spent years protecting, sheltering. Ethan was supposed to be grateful. Grateful for the life Charles had given him after the accident. Grateful for the safety and security of their world. But now, in the face of this new reality, Charles felt the ground beneath him shift. "You are fragile, Ethan," Charles shot back, his voice rising. "You don't understand what you're saying. You can't just go around treating everyone the same. People like her—" He motioned to Maya, who had stepped back but still stood tall. "They don't belong in your world. You're not like everyone else. You're different." Maya flinched at his words, but her determination didn't waver. She stood her ground, her eyes steady on Charles. "And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with being different? Ethan doesn't need to be protected from the world. He needs to be a part of it." She paused, the weight of what she was about to say hanging in the air. "He needs to live, not just survive." Charles recoiled, the words stinging. He had always believed that keeping Ethan away from the world, keeping him safe, was the right thing to do. But now, as Maya spoke, the edges of his certainty began to fray. "I'm just trying to keep him safe," Charles muttered, more to himself than anyone else, his voice cracking under the pressure of his emotions. "I didn't want him to suffer the way Olivia did." The mention of Olivia sent a sharp pain through his chest. His wife, his beloved Olivia, had been taken from them so suddenly. The accident, the shattered pieces of their lives, it had all happened so fast. And Ethan, his son, had been left broken in its wake. He could still remember that phone call, the hospital room, the way Olivia's hand grew cold in his as he held it, knowing that nothing would ever be the same. Ethan was his last tie to her, his last tie to the life they had built together. Charles's voice grew softer, more reflective. "I couldn't save her, Maya. I couldn't save her, and now I can't lose him too. I can't lose my son." Maya's eyes softened, and she took a step closer, though she was still fearful of Charles's anger. "I understand. I really do," she said quietly. "But you can't protect him from everything. You can't lock him away forever. You're not just protecting him from the world. You're protecting him from life." She paused, her voice gaining strength. "And he's been so sad, so alone. He needs more than just your protection, Charles. He needs to be seen for who he is." Charles's chest tightened as her words sank in. She's right. He had spent so long trying to protect Ethan that he had failed to see what his son truly needed. Ethan needed someone who understood him, someone who saw beyond the wheelchair, beyond the accident. Ethan needed someone who didn't just see him as a broken boy, but as a whole person, capable of laughter, of joy, of friendship. Charles's mind began to churn with the weight of his past decisions. He had kept Ethan sheltered, kept him from the world. But at what cost? He had built walls around his son, believing they were there to protect him. But now, standing here, looking at Ethan's anger, his hurt, Charles realized the walls he had built had only kept Ethan trapped. As the silence stretched on, memories flooded Charles's mind. The accident. The look of horror on Ethan's face when he realized he couldn't move his legs. The days spent in the hospital, the endless doctor's visits, the therapies that never seemed to do enough. And Olivia, her death had shattered everything. Charles had told himself that if he kept Ethan in a bubble, if he kept him safe, everything would be okay. He would be okay. But now, standing in front of him, Maya was forcing him to confront the truth he had been avoiding. Ethan wasn't okay. Ethan hadn't been okay for a long time. Charles closed his eyes for a moment, his breath shaky. He could still see Olivia's face, still hear her voice in the back of his mind, soft and reassuring. "Promise me you'll protect him, Charles. Promise me you'll keep him safe." He had promised, and for 2 years he had kept that promise, at least in the way he thought was best. But now, as he looked at Ethan and Maya, he realized that his idea of protection had been warped by fear and grief. It wasn't protection at all. It was control. His heart pounded in his chest as a realization hit him with force. I've been doing it all wrong. The thought of losing Ethan, the thought of him being taken from him just like Olivia had been, had consumed him. And in his fear, he had pushed Ethan away. He had controlled his every move, his every choice, all in the name of love. But love didn't look like this. It didn't look like walls. It didn't look like isolation. "I'm sorry," Charles whispered, his voice barely audible. It wasn't the apology he'd wanted to say, but it was the truth. He opened his eyes, and for the first time he saw Ethan clearly, not as a fragile boy in need of protection, but as his son. A person with hopes and dreams, and yes, needs. Needs he had ignored for far too long. Ethan looked at him, his eyes wide, unsure of what to make of this sudden shift in his father's demeanor. The hurt was still there, deep in his eyes, but there was also something else. Hope, maybe? Or was it just the exhaustion of fighting a battle he never thought he could win? "Don't do that," Ethan said, his voice trembling, but the anger was gone now. "Don't treat me like I'm some fragile thing that can't take care of himself. I'm not broken, Dad. I'm not. You need to understand that. I'm still me." Charles nodded slowly, the weight of his own failings pressing down on him. He wanted to say so much more. He wanted to explain, to apologize in ways words couldn't capture. But all he could manage was a quiet, "I know, son, I know." Maya, still standing by the door, watched the exchange between father and son, her heart swelling with both relief and sadness. This moment, this reckoning, had been a long time coming. And as much as she wanted to say more, to reach out to Charles, to make him understand everything she had seen in Ethan, she knew that this moment wasn't hers to control. But there was hope now. Maybe, just maybe, the walls that Charles had built around his son, around both of them, were starting to crack. Charles turned toward Maya, his gaze softer now. He stopped, unsure of how to continue. "I was wrong. I've been wrong about everything." Maya didn't say anything, but her eyes met his with a quiet understanding. She didn't need to hear the words. She had already known. For the first time in a long while, Charles felt like he was seeing his son for who he truly was, not through the lens of fear and protection, but through the lens of love. True love. Not the kind that isolates, but the kind that lets someone live. "I'm sorry," Charles repeated, this time with more conviction. "I promise I'll do better. I'll let you live, Ethan." The tension in the room lifted slightly, but there was still a long road ahead. The damage had been done. But as Charles looked at Ethan, and then at Maya, he knew they were starting to rebuild something. Something he had never allowed himself to see before, a real family. And for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could be whole again. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the tension that hung between them. Charles stood rigid, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, still processing the conversation he had just had with Ethan. His son, had stood up to him, and not in a way Charles was prepared for. As he looked at Ethan now, his heart ached, his eyes scanning the boy who had once been so small, so fragile in his arms, and now stood tall, determined. Ethan's words lingered in the air like a bomb that had yet to explode. "I don't want to live in your house anymore." Charles felt the weight of those words like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left him breathless. The realization hit him like a freight train. His son, the one he had been so obsessed with protecting, was willing to walk away from the very thing Charles had worked to create, his world. And not for any reason Charles could control or understand, but for the friendship that had blossomed between Ethan and Maya. For a friendship that Charles had failed to see. The words reverberated in his mind over and over, a constant echo in the pit of his stomach. He wanted to respond, to tell Ethan that this was absurd, that he had no choice but to stay here, in this house, where he could be safe, protected from the world. But the words wouldn't come. Ethan's gaze never wavered. His eyes were filled with an intensity that Charles had never seen before. Defiance, courage, independence. For the first time in what felt like forever, Charles saw his son as he truly was, strong, brave, and unwilling to be caged any longer. "I don't want to live here anymore, Dad," Ethan repeated, his voice steady but edged with raw emotion. "I don't want to be trapped in a place where I can't have a real friend, a place where I can't live." Maya, still standing by his side, looked up at Charles, her expression fierce. She had been quiet until now, standing in Ethan's shadow, but now she spoke with a quiet strength that took Charles off guard. "How much longer, Charles?" Maya's voice broke through the thick tension in the room. "How much longer are you going to keep him locked away? How much longer are you going to make him feel like he's something broken? I didn't ask for this. I didn't come here to cause trouble. But Ethan, he needs more than what you're giving him, and I'm not going to apologize for being his friend, for making him feel alive again." Charles's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand. He was just trying to protect Ethan. He was trying to shield him from the pain he couldn't fix. But something inside him shifted. Her words, though firm, were filled with a quiet truth. He had spent so much time trying to keep Ethan safe, trying to protect him from the world, that he had never stopped to think what Ethan actually needed. Maya wasn't afraid of Ethan's disability. She wasn't afraid of his pain. She wasn't afraid to see Ethan as a person capable of love, joy, friendship. But Charles had been afraid of seeing Ethan as more than his accident. He had been afraid of letting go, letting Ethan make his own choices, let him live freely. Maya didn't give him that luxury of control. "You don't understand," Charles finally said, his voice cracking under the weight of his own admission. He stepped back, his mind whirling, trying to piece together the unraveling threads of the life he had so carefully constructed. "I'm just trying to protect him. I'm trying to protect you both. From what happened. From what could happen." Maya didn't flinch, didn't look away. "You don't protect him by keeping him isolated in here, Charles. You don't protect him by keeping him locked away from everyone. You protect him by letting him live." Her words were like a slap to his face. Charles closed his eyes, pressing his hand to his temple, trying to stave off the overwhelming rush of emotion. He could feel the walls he had so carefully built around his son, around himself, starting to crumble. He had built his life around the idea of safety, of control. But safety hadn't fixed anything. It hadn't healed Ethan's broken heart, hadn't fixed the loneliness that Charles had failed to see until now. "Ethan," Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I never wanted you to feel like this. I never wanted you to be alone." Ethan's face softened, but there was no pity in his gaze. "I'm not alone, Dad. Not anymore. But I have to be able to live my life. I need to have my own choices, my own voice. I need to be me again, not just your project." The words stung. They were raw, honest, but they were the truth, and Charles knew it. He had tried to hold on to the past, tried to keep everything the way it was before Olivia's death. But life didn't work like that. Life didn't stop for grief, didn't stop for fear. It moved forward, and Ethan was moving forward, whether Charles was ready for it or not. Maya stepped closer, her voice softening. "Charles, Ethan doesn't need a cage. He needs a life, a real one. And if you keep pushing him away, if you keep treating him like he's broken, he'll never have that." Charles turned his head, looking at Maya, then back at Ethan. His heart ached with the weight of his own mistakes. He had tried to protect his son from everything, even from the things that might have healed him. He had tried to protect Ethan from living, and in doing so, he had turned his own home into a prison. He had locked Ethan away in the name of protection, but the key to that prison had always been in Ethan's hands. And now, for the first time, Ethan was holding it up and saying, "I'm free." Charles couldn't argue with that. His emotions were a storm now, a tangled mess of regret, guilt, and fear. He had always believed he was doing the right thing. But standing here, in the presence of his son, with the truth so painfully clear, he realized how wrong he had been. The tears that had been building in his chest for so long finally spilled over. He turned away, unable to hold them back anymore. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, but the weight of everything he had tried to control, everything he had failed to see, was too much. "I'm sorry, Ethan," Charles whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." Ethan didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, watching his father. And in that moment, Charles saw something in his son's eyes. Something that wasn't just anger or resentment, but hope. "Maybe," Ethan said softly, "maybe we can start over." Charles turned to face him, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and fear. "I'd like that," he replied quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd like that very much." The silence between them was heavy, but not oppressive. It wasn't the silence of anger or confusion anymore. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding, real understanding. Maya, standing beside Ethan, smiled softly. For the first time, Charles realized that she wasn't just a friend to Ethan. She was a bridge between him and the life he had been denying himself. "I think," Maya said, her voice gentle, "that this is the beginning of something new. For all of you." Charles didn't respond at first. But as he looked at his son, and then at Maya, he felt something stir inside him. He wasn't sure how it would all play out, how they would move forward. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had a chance. A chance to be the father Ethan needed, not the one he had been trying to be. A chance to let go of the past, to stop controlling everything, and to allow his son to live. And maybe, just maybe, he could start living too. The silence in the room was thick, like the calm before a storm. Charles stood there, just inside the doorway of the living room, still trying to process everything that had unfolded between him, Ethan, and Maya. His chest felt tight, his emotions swirling in a way that he couldn't control. He had been a father to Ethan for years, but for the first time, he wasn't sure he had truly been a father at all. He had tried to protect Ethan. He had tried to keep him safe, to shield him from the world and the pain that it brought. But in doing so, he had missed the most important part of being a father: truly seeing his son for who he was, not just as a patient to be fixed, not just as a reminder of the tragedy that had torn their family apart, but as a young boy with hopes, dreams, and the right to live his life fully. Charles had been blind to all of that. Until now. Ethan, still standing across the room, was staring out the window, his back to Charles. The boy's shoulders were tense, the anger still simmering beneath the surface. But there was something different in the air now, a quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. Maya was still standing by Ethan's side, her gaze soft but filled with a quiet determination. She had helped Ethan find his voice, his strength. But now, it was Charles who had to find his. For the first time, Charles felt the overwhelming weight of his own mistakes. He had spent so much time controlling, so much time fearing what might happen, that he had never stopped to ask what Ethan truly needed, what he needed. It was all so painfully clear to him now. Taking a deep breath, Charles stepped forward, his heart pounding. He didn't know if he could fix things with Ethan, if he could ever truly undo the damage he had done. But this moment, this quiet, humbling moment, was the only chance he had to begin making things right. "Ethan," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't turn around at first. He didn't acknowledge his father's voice. But Charles wasn't going to walk away this time. He wasn't going to retreat back into his own shell of pride and fear. I've been wrong, son," Charles continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I've treated you like you were broken, like you needed to be protected from everything. And I've been so caught up in my own fear that I didn't see you for who you really are." The words felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders, but there was still so much more to say, so much more to express. For so long, Charles had been afraid to show his vulnerability. He had been afraid to admit that he had no answers, no way to fix everything that had gone wrong. But here, with his son standing before him, he realized that his need for control had only pushed Ethan away. It had only made things worse. Charles took another step closer to Ethan, this time pausing just behind him. "I'm sorry, Ethan," he whispered. "I'm so sorry for treating you like you were something to be fixed, for treating you like you were broken. You're not broken. You're my son, and you're everything I ever wanted you to be." Ethan slowly turned around, his expression unreadable. There was still a lingering sadness in his eyes, but there was something else there, too. Hope. Maybe it was the smallest spark, but it was there, and it made Charles's heart ache with both relief and guilt. Ethan didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, his gaze steady. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I don't want you to fix me, Dad. I just want you to see me." Charles's throat tightened, and his eyes blurred with unshed tears. He hadn't known what he had been missing until now. But he saw Ethan. He truly saw him, for the first time in years. Ethan wasn't just the broken boy in the wheelchair. He wasn't just the reminder of the tragedy that had struck their family. He was a young boy with his own dreams, his own life to live, his own desires for happiness. And Charles had almost missed it all. Maya, who had been standing silently by Ethan's side, stepped forward now. She was quiet, but her presence was a comfort to both of them. She had witnessed the entire exchange, and though she hadn't spoken much, her role in this moment was undeniable. She had given Ethan something Charles couldn't, the freedom to feel normal. Charles turned to Maya, his expression softening. "I owe you an apology, too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've treated you like an outsider. I've kept you at arm's length because I didn't think you belonged in our world. But I was wrong. You've done something for Ethan that I couldn't." He stopped, his throat constricting as the weight of it all hit him. "You've made him happy." Maya looked up at him, her face a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "I never meant to take anything away from you, Charles," she said quietly. "I just wanted to help. Ethan has been so lonely, and all I wanted was to make him smile again. He's been through so much. I never wanted to be a burden." Charles shook his head, his eyes filled with guilt. "You weren't a burden, Maya. You've been a lifeline. I've been so focused on controlling everything that I couldn't see the one thing Ethan needed most. Maya's gaze softened and she nodded, the tiniest smile tugging at her lips. I'm glad I could help. I just want Ethan to be happy, to feel normal. Charles turned back to Ethan, his heart swelling with emotion. He could see the bond between them, the deep friendship that had formed in the most unlikely of places. Maya had shown Ethan that he could still have friends, that he could still be a part of the world outside of his wheelchair. And in doing so, she had given Charles's son something he could never have given him: freedom. I want to support you, Charles said to Ethan, his voice steady. I want you to have the freedom to live your life, to have your friends, to be happy. I won't stand in your way anymore, I promise. Ethan's eyes widened, his lips trembling as he fought back tears. It wasn't just the apology that had touched him. It was the change in his father, the shift in his tone, the sincerity in his words. For the first time, Ethan felt like Charles was really seeing him, not as a fragile patient, but as a young man with hopes and dreams of his own. Thank you, Dad, Ethan whispered. Charles reached out, his hand trembling as he placed it on Ethan's shoulder. I love you, son. I always have. Ethan looked up at him, the light in his eyes now brighter than ever. I love you too, Dad. Maya, standing quietly beside them, smiled softly. She hadn't expected this kind of change, this kind of breakthrough. But she knew it was important for Ethan and important for Charles. They were moving forward, together. Charles turned back to Maya, his face filled with genuine gratitude. I'll support your friendship, Maya. I'll support both of you. And if there's anything I can do to help, just let me know. Maya's smile widened and she nodded. Thank you, Charles. That means more than you know. For the first time, Charles felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. The years of fear and control, the walls he had built around himself and his son, were slowly starting to crumble. There was still a long way to go, but this was the first step, a step toward healing, toward understanding, and most importantly, toward love. As Charles looked at Ethan and Maya, standing side by side, he realized that the family he had longed to protect wasn't one that needed shelter from the world. It was a family that needed to be free, to live, to grow, and to love without fear. And for the first time, Charles knew that he was ready to let them do just that. The days that followed the confrontation were heavy with change. Charles had known that rebuilding the trust between him and Ethan would be a slow, painful process, but he had underestimated how deeply it would cut. Every moment with Ethan now felt like stepping into uncharted territory. The walls between them, once built of fear and overprotectiveness, were crumbling, but they left behind jagged edges that Charles wasn't sure how to smooth over. Ethan, for his part, had been quieter in the days since the emotional showdown. His defiance was still there, still simmering under the surface, but it was tempered now with something softer, something that reminded Charles of the boy Ethan had once been. There were moments when Ethan looked at him, and Charles could see the flicker of trust returning in his eyes. But there was also the faint trace of something else: uncertainty. It was as though Ethan was still unsure whether his father could truly change. Charles spent the days trying to prove himself, trying to give Ethan the space he needed without hovering, trying to show him that he was no longer the father who kept him locked away from the world. But each attempt was met with cautious resistance. That morning, Charles stood in the doorway of the living room, watching as Ethan and Maya sat on the floor, laughing over some inside joke, their heads bent close together. The sight was strange yet familiar, as though it were a scene from some other life, one where Charles wasn't so tightly wound, so consumed with control. Ethan, who had once spent so many hours alone, was now laughing, truly laughing, with a friend. And for the first time in years, Charles realized how much he had taken that laughter for granted. Maya's presence had done more for Ethan than Charles had ever thought possible. She had breathed life into his son, given him back the joy that had been swallowed by grief and fear. And watching them now, Charles couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Maya's friendship, but for the way she had helped Ethan open up, helped him find the pieces of himself that had been lost. But it was a slow process. Charles had taken a step back. He had let Ethan and Maya be, given them the space to build their friendship without interference. But it wasn't always easy. His old instincts, the ones that told him to control, to manage, to make sure everything stayed safe, were still there, lurking beneath the surface. Every time Ethan went out with Maya, every time they shared a laugh or a moment of joy, Charles fought the urge to step in, to remind Ethan of the dangers lurking in the world, to protect him from the things that had always felt too risky. But as he watched them now, a small voice inside him told him that the world wasn't as dangerous as he had always thought. The real danger, perhaps, had always been in the way he kept Ethan locked away, suffocating him with his constant need for control. And as painful as it was, Charles was starting to see that giving Ethan the space to grow, to make mistakes, was the only way to rebuild the relationship that had been shattered. "Do you want to join us?" Maya's voice broke through his thoughts, soft and inviting. Charles blinked, realizing he had been standing there longer than he thought. He stepped into the room, his heart still heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. I don't want to intrude," he said, his voice unsure. Ethan looked up at him, his expression softening. "You're not intruding, Dad." He smiled, a real smile, the kind that made Charles's chest tighten. "We're just talking about some of the crazy stuff we did when we were younger." Charles nodded, the lump in his throat threatening to choke him. He walked slowly toward them, sitting at the edge of the couch where Maya had left a space for him. The ease with which Ethan and Maya interacted, how natural it seemed for them to laugh together, to share stories, felt both comforting and painful to Charles. It was clear now that they were building something real, something Charles had never fully understood. "I'm glad you two have each other," Charles said quietly, his eyes meeting Ethan's. There was an honesty in his voice now that hadn't been there before, a vulnerability that he hadn't allowed himself to express for years. Ethan's eyes softened, and for the first time Charles saw something like forgiveness in his son's gaze. "We're a team, Dad. We've been through a lot together." Charles nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "I'm proud of you, Ethan," he whispered. "I know I've made mistakes, but I want to do better. I want to be the father you deserve." Ethan didn't respond immediately, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that told Charles that, while the journey was far from over, they were on the right path. Maya smiled softly at them, and Charles could see the genuine care she had for Ethan in her gaze. It was more than just friendship. It was a bond that Charles had not fully understood until now. Maya had given Ethan something no one else could: acceptance. The kind of acceptance that made Ethan feel like he could just be, without fear of being judged, without the constant weight of his disability hanging over him. "You've really helped him," Charles said, turning to Maya. His voice was quieter now, as if the full weight of his gratitude had only just begun to settle in his chest. "I'm not sure I can ever thank you enough." Maya shrugged, a soft smile on her lips. "I just wanted to make him happy. He's been through so much. He deserves more than just to be protected. He deserves to live." Charles felt his throat tighten again. He could hear the truth in her words, and it made him feel even more ashamed of the walls he had built around his son. But there was no more time for regret. There was only time for change. "Thank you," Charles repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done more for him than I ever could have." Maya met his gaze with a warmth that was hard to ignore. "I'm just glad he has you, Charles. You're not as lost as you think you are." Her words stung in a way he hadn't expected, but they were also a lifeline. He was learning, slowly but surely, that it wasn't too late to change. That even after all the mistakes, after the years of controlling everything, he could still be the father Ethan needed. Later that day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Charles found himself alone in the study, the weight of the day's events settling over him. He had a lot to think about, but more than that, he had a lot to do. The conversation with Maya had left him feeling vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt in years, but it had also given him the clarity he needed to understand how deeply his protective instincts had hurt Ethan. As he sat there, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, straightening in his chair. Linda, Maya's mother, stepped into the room. Her presence was quiet but warm, the lines on her face etched with the wisdom of years lived through hard work and sacrifice. "I didn't want to interrupt," Linda said, her voice gentle, "but I wanted to thank you, Charles, for letting Maya and Ethan have their friendship. It's been good for both of them." Charles looked up at her, his chest heavy. "I don't think I really understood what I was doing, what I've been doing. It's a little too late for some things, but I'm trying." Linda nodded, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "I've seen the change in both of them. Maya's always been strong, but seeing her with Ethan, it's something special. She's always had a way of bringing people together." Charles met her gaze, his heart swelling with emotion. "I don't think I can ever thank you enough for raising such a remarkable daughter." Linda's smile deepened, and she took a step forward. "All I want is for my daughter to have a place where she's valued. I can see that you're trying, Charles, and that means a lot. Don't be too hard on yourself. You're learning, and that's what matters." Charles nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you, Linda. I'm trying. I really am." As Linda left, Charles sat back in his chair, the quiet of the study surrounding him. He had a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. He had a son who still loved him, and he had a daughter who had helped him see what he had been blind to for so long. The healing was only just beginning, but Charles knew that with each step, they were moving toward something better, something real, something whole. The dining room was quiet, but in a different way, the kind of quiet that filled the room with warmth, not tension. Charles, Ethan, and Maya sat around the table, the faint clink of silverware against plates the only sound. The once dominant unease that had always shadowed their family meals was gone, replaced by a comfortable, almost serene silence. Charles had insisted on preparing dinner himself that evening, a small but meaningful gesture of the changes he was trying to make. He had never been one for domestic tasks, believing that his time and effort should go toward providing for the family in more tangible ways. But tonight, he had made the effort. Ethan and Maya had helped him in their own way, Maya chopping vegetables with surprising skill, and Ethan offering the occasional suggestion, something Charles had never expected from his son. The meal wasn't anything extravagant, just a simple roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and a salad. But to Charles it was more than enough. It was the first time in years that they had sat down together without the shadow of grief and tension hanging over them. "These mashed potatoes are really good," Ethan said, his voice light, his eyes twinkling with something Charles hadn't seen in a long time, genuine contentment. He'd come a long way since that night when he'd confronted his father about wanting more than just protection. "Thanks," Charles replied, glancing at his son. There was no pretense in Ethan's smile, no forced politeness, just a boy enjoying dinner with his family. For the first time, Charles truly understood what that meant. Maya reached for another roll, her fingers brushing against Charles's hand briefly as they both reached for it at the same time. She looked up, offering him a small smile, and for a moment, Charles felt the weight of everything, of all the changes, the apologies, and the healing that had taken place. It was still fragile, still new, but it was real. "You know, I never thought I'd see the day when you made dinner," Maya teased lightly, breaking the quiet. "You've really surprised me, Charles." Charles chuckled, shaking his head. "I figured if I was going to make a change, I might as well start with the small things." Ethan smiled at that. "I'm just glad you finally realized the kitchen's not just for storing takeout boxes." Charles laughed, the sound genuine. His heart swelled with pride, and for a moment, he allowed himself to just be in the moment, not worrying about tomorrow or next week, but just enjoying the presence of the two people who had been there for him when he had needed them most. The awkward tension that had once existed between them, the wall of silence Charles had built to protect himself and his son, was gradually fading away. What had started with a few small steps of understanding was now blossoming into something new. There was a comfort in their interactions now, something that was no longer forced. And for the first time, Charles realized how much that had been missing from their lives. As the evening drew on, Maya shared a few light-hearted stories about her childhood, and Ethan chimed in with his own memories, both of them laughing together as Charles listened, his heart full. It wasn't just about what was being said, it was about the feeling that filled the room, a feeling that had been absent for too long, a feeling of connection, of joy, of family. After dinner, as they sat back in their chairs, letting the warmth of the meal settle in, Charles took a deep breath. He had something he needed to say, something he had been thinking about for days, ever since he had begun to fully grasp the importance of Maya in their lives. "I've been thinking," Charles began, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "I realize that I haven't done nearly enough to show my appreciation for everything you've done for Ethan, Maya. Not just for him, but for me, too. You've been a constant presence in his life when I couldn't be. You've given him something I couldn't, true happiness, and I've never been able to thank you properly for that." Maya's eyes softened, her hand resting gently on the table as she met his gaze. "Charles, you don't have to thank me," she said quietly. "I've always cared about Ethan, and I just want him to be happy. That's enough for me." Charles nodded, but he knew it wasn't enough. Not anymore. He had come to realize that in a way he hadn't before. Maya had played a crucial role in Ethan's healing. She had given him something that no amount of money, no amount of protection could provide. She had given him the gift of normalcy, of friendship, of laughter. And in doing so, she had helped Charles understand what it meant to truly see his son. "I know," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I've been thinking a lot about how I can give back, about how I can do more for you, and for Maya and Ethan both. I've realized that I've never truly understood your position in this house, or your role in Ethan's life. So I'd like to offer you something, Maya. A position here, with more responsibility, one that reflects the support you've given us. You've done so much already. I want to ensure that you're recognized for it." Maya's eyebrows shot up in surprise, her mouth opening slightly as if unsure of how to respond. Charles could see the hesitation in her eyes, but he continued undeterred. "I want you to know that this isn't just about you being Ethan's friend. You've become an important part of our family, and I want to make sure that's acknowledged." Maya was quiet for a moment, her gaze dropping to her hands before meeting his again. "Charles, I don't know what to say. I never expected—" "You don't have to say anything," Charles interrupted gently. "I just want to do what's right by you. I know that words are never enough, but I hope this shows you that I see you for who you are, and I value everything you've done for Ethan and for this family." There was a long pause, and then Maya slowly nodded, her eyes softening with gratitude. "Thank you, Charles. That means more to me than you know." As the evening continued, Charles felt a sense of contentment settle in his chest. He had spent so many years fighting against change, afraid of what it might mean for his life, for his family. But now, he was starting to understand that change wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be embraced. And as the three of them sat together, laughing and talking, Charles realized that his wealth and status meant little in comparison to the joy and love that filled the room. He had spent so much time trying to protect Ethan from the world, trying to shield him from harm. But now he understood that the world wasn't what he should have been afraid of. What he should have been afraid of was losing the people he loved, losing the connections that made life worth living. For the first time in years, Charles felt at peace with himself. The journey was far from over, but it had begun, and that was enough. Later, as he walked to the door to see Maya off, Charles paused before she left. "Maya," he said, his voice sincere. "I'm glad you're here. I really am." Maya smiled warmly at him, and Charles could see the soft, genuine appreciation in her expression. "Thank you, Charles, for everything." As she left, Charles stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her go, then turning to look back at Ethan, who had wandered into the living room to put his books away. "Hey, Dad!" Ethan called, noticing his father standing still in the hallway. "Thanks for dinner tonight. It was nice." Charles smiled and walked toward him. "You're welcome, son. And just so you know, I'm always here, okay? Always." Ethan's smile reached his eyes. "I know, Dad. I know." And for the first time, Charles truly believed it. The healing had begun, not just for Ethan, but for the family as a whole. The path ahead would still have its bumps and struggles, but Charles knew they could face it together. With Maya's friendship, with Ethan's courage, and with his own willingness to let go of control, the future felt a little brighter, a little more hopeful. For the first time in a long while, Charles felt like they were on the brink of something real, something good, something that would last. A new beginning. The living room was quiet, save for the gentle rustling of cards and the soft sounds of laughter that filled the air. The room that had once been a place of tension and silence, where the weight of grief, control, and unspoken words had hung like a thick fog, now held an entirely different energy. There was a warmth to the space, a sense of lightness that Charles had never truly experienced before. Charles sat on the floor, his back resting against the couch, a wide grin spread across his face as he looked at Ethan and Maya. They were bent over the coffee table, their laughter contagious, as they played a board game. A game that, at first, Charles had only reluctantly agreed to join. But now, seeing Ethan's face light up with joy, Charles couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this relaxed, this free. The once distant walls of his family, built over years of isolation, grief, and fear, were gone. In their place was something far more meaningful, something real. Ethan rolled the dice and moved his piece across the board, a look of determination on his face. "You're not going to win this time, Maya," he said, grinning from ear to ear. Maya, sitting cross-legged on the floor, shot him a playful glance. "We'll see about that." She picked up her own piece, gliding it along the board with a flourish. "I've got tricks up my sleeve." Charles couldn't help but chuckle at the banter between them. For months, he had watched as Ethan retreated further into himself, as his son became more withdrawn and isolated, just as he had when the accident had taken so much from him. But now, watching him engage with Maya, watching him laugh, play, and experience life again, Charles felt a profound sense of relief. It was as though he were seeing his son for the first time in years. Ethan had grown. He had found his voice, his joy, and his sense of self again. And Maya had been the bridge that connected him back to the world, a friendship that had blossomed from something pure and genuine. Charles had never expected the relationship between them to become so important, but now he saw how vital it was. Maya had done more for Ethan than Charles ever could have. She had given him the one thing he had been missing, the chance to live again. As Maya and Ethan continued their playful exchange, Charles leaned back, letting the sounds of their laughter wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace, a peace that came not from controlling everything, not from protecting Ethan from the world, but from allowing him to be who he was meant to be. This is what it's supposed to feel like, Charles thought. This is what family should be. As the game continued, Charles found himself thinking back on everything that had led him here, the mistakes, the missed opportunities, the fear that had driven him to control every aspect of Ethan's life. He had spent so long trying to protect his son, thinking that love was about keeping him safe, about keeping him sheltered. But now, after everything that had transpired, Charles knew that true love wasn't about control. It was about freedom. It was about letting the people you loved grow, make mistakes, and experience happiness, even if it meant stepping back and letting them live life on their own terms. He had learned so much from Ethan, about strength, about resilience, about the power of laughter and friendship. And from Maya, he had learned the importance of letting go of his own fears, of trusting that things didn't have to be perfect to be real. Maya had shown him that love wasn't about perfection, but about acceptance. It wasn't about fixing everything, it was about being there for each other when it mattered most. As the game came to an end, Ethan jumped up with a cheer, raising his arms in victory. "I won! I finally beat you, Maya!" he exclaimed, his face beaming with excitement. Maya groaned in mock frustration, but there was no bitterness in her voice. "Well, you earned it," she said, laughing. "I guess I'll have to work harder next time." Charles watched them, his heart swelling with pride. For so long, he had been too focused on controlling the outcomes of every situation, too focused on protecting Ethan from the world, from pain, from failure. But now, he saw that the world, though imperfect, though sometimes difficult, was the very thing that had helped Ethan come alive again. "I'm proud of you, Ethan," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan turned to look at him, his eyes full of warmth and understanding. "Thanks, Dad," he said, his smile genuine. "I'm proud of you, too." The words were simple, but they carried so much meaning that had taken months, even years, to uncover. As the night wore on, the three of them shared stories and jokes, the conversation flowing effortlessly between them. Charles felt a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he was missing. For the first time, he wasn't just the father, he was a part of this family, fully present, fully engaged. The distance that had once separated him from Ethan, the walls that had kept him from truly connecting with his son, were beginning to fade. The healing was slow, but it was real. At one point, Maya paused, her eyes glancing toward the door. "I think I should head home," she said. "Thanks for letting me stay for dinner and for playing the game with us." Charles looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Maya, I'm glad you're here. You've helped bring something into this house that I never thought I'd see again: laughter, joy, and connection. I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for Ethan, for us." Maya smiled warmly, her eyes softening. "You don't have to thank me, Charles. I just wanted to be there for Ethan, and I'm glad you're starting to see him for who he really is." As Maya stood up to leave, Charles caught her hand. "Before you go, I want you to know that I appreciate you more than you'll ever know. You've taught me so much about what it means to love someone without trying to control them. I won't ever forget that." Maya's smile widened, and she squeezed his hand gently. "I'll always be here, Charles, for both of you." After Maya left, Charles and Ethan remained in the living room, the soft hum of the evening settling in. The house, once cold and full of unspoken words, now felt alive with possibilities. The healing had only just begun, but Charles was starting to understand something crucial. The journey was worth it. The road to rebuilding trust, to reconnecting with Ethan, wasn't going to be easy. But the love that surrounded him, love that was no longer based on fear or control, made everything feel possible. Charles turned to Ethan, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "I'm sorry for everything, son. For trying to control you. For not seeing you for who you really are. But I promise you, I'm going to do better. I'm going to be the father you deserve." Ethan looked at him, his eyes filled with warmth. "You've already started, Dad." Charles smiled, his heart full. For the first time, he realized that starting was all they really needed. The family was whole again, not perfect, but real. And that was more than enough. As he sat there with Ethan, Charles thought about everything they had been through, everything they had lost, and everything they had gained. The path ahead would still have its struggles, but Charles felt a deep sense of peace, one he had never known before. True wealth wasn't measured in money or status. It wasn't found in buildings or possessions. It was found in moments like these, the moments when you could finally be yourself, surrounded by the people who truly cared about you. And for Charles, that was the most valuable thing of all. The future, uncertain as it was, felt a little brighter now. And for the first time, he was ready to face it, with his family by his side. The story had come full circle. And as Charles looked at Ethan, he knew this was only the beginning of something better.